Hi, my name's Mark Parry, and I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about e-learning and the role of instructional design. Now, suppose you worked for a telecommunications company and you needed to train your staff about a change to the billing system. Now, you might it's a very obvious place to start to grab a copy of the bill. Now, what an instructional designer does is transforms the piece of content, in this case it's a telephone bill, into something that is more engaging, more likely to be appealing for the end user or the learner or the student. Now this is one example of how something like a phone bill might be transformed. I've added these little blue boxes to cover some information that's not so relevant. But basically, we've got a timeline at the top, which just instantly makes it a lot easier for somebody that's just being introduced to understand what the key tasks are at a particular point in time. There's also the charges down on the lower left that have been extracted from the bill and itemized. There's also labels, arrows, other instructions, other information. And so keep in mind, this is just one example. And if you're a teacher doing an effective lesson, teaching an effective lesson, you're probably doing instructional design anyway. It's just that it's not documented and it's not formalized. So there's a lot of overlap between teaching and instructional design. Instructional design becomes more relevant when you're dealing with developing learning resources as opposed to just teaching as such. Now, I tend to use the ADDIE model. The ADDIE model has its controversies, and some people don't like it. Some people say it's too restrictive. Essentially, I'll just use it as an overview: analysis, design, development, implementation, and evaluation. There are other models, by the way, but I won't go into those in this recording. So first is analysis. Now, here we have on the screen develop work priorities training package. We've got elements, performance criteria. Now, if you're a member of the vocational education and training community, you would instantly recognize this as a document. For those people that are not familiar with the VET environment, vocational education and training, this is basically representative of any syllabus document, any curriculum document, anything that actually shows you or documents what your students or what your learners need to achieve. And so obviously in university this sort of document would be slightly different. In a corporate environment, maybe there's a particular way that this is written up, but typically this is what an instructional designer starts with, and the key task is to analyze what's in here. So that process might take a day, it might take an hour, it might take a month, might be a part of a committee, could be a team of instructional designers working very closely with teachers. It's all very flexible, but I find that the starting point of any sort of analysis is just to find the evidence or find the guidelines of what is being taught and who is being who are the learners. Now, the next step is design. Now, in design, you probably have guessed it's quite a creative process. So we start off with our document in the center, and we look at what the students need to do for their assessment. Now, keep in mind, I am really simplifying this. There's a lot more detail that I could have gone into with analysis and all of the components, but I'm just keeping it very, very simple. I tend to look at the assessment and gear everything around the assessment because that's the purpose of such a document. After all, they're not there for they might experience other things while they're completing their learning, but essentially the assessment is what they're mostly interested in. So I've just added, when I present this slideshow face to face, I ask the audience what is that, and then we have a 5-minute discussion about what that represents. Same with this one, and that we start to get into the detail of designing a course, but then we show this picture, and they're kind of it throws them. The reason that I have it in here is because the design process is very creative. There's no one single correct answer, and so even though you have your document in the middle, the way that you engage with that document and the way that you design your course is not determined in a simple way. So we'll move on. This summarizes the idea that all of those components within the course, whether they be schedules, whether they be evidence of some sort of document in a workplace, or whether it be an agriculture student has to provide evidence of a chicken of some sort. That could be an assessment item. But basically, whether something's an assessment item or not, it's still, in theory, is preparing the student for their assessment. If just say there is an exam right at the end and no other form of assessment, then all of what they have been learning, every reading, every experience, every discussion, would be preparing them for their assessment. But obviously, assessment design, you might have assessment items throughout their learning. Now, here's an example of the relationship, or a representation rather, of the relationship between the learner, the facilitator, and the assessment items. And so there's a whole range of assessment items here that the learner has to produce, that the assessor or the facilitator or the mentor has to give them a tick or give them a mark or a grade of some sort. That's a really important part of designing a course, whether it be online, face-to-face, blended. Now, just suppose that an important aspect of your requirements of the learner is interaction and collaboration. You can design activities that enable the learner to achieve those learning outcomes or those competencies. For example, they might have engage in an online discussion, and they might add a reflection to their blog, and then the teacher or the facilitator or the mentor would read that, and then that might contribute to their assessment. Or they might watch a video that triggers some ideas, or read an article, and then they might engage with some sort of interaction either with the teacher or with each other about some of the important points. They're just two examples of like a very high number of ways that you can guide your learners to achieve their learning outcomes. Now, the second D in ADDIE stands for development. Now, generally, the development phase is kept after most of the analysis and the design is completed. In other words, it's not a very good idea to just start rushing in to develop content without doing the first two steps. Even though the ADDIE model is very fluid, and I find that it's not locked off into very separate stages that are clearly defined, it's still important to remember that development right up front is not a very good idea. Now, here's an example. I used to have a screenshot on the left there, but I have removed it. But it's just a summary, if you like, of a course that I helped to develop, and these are the components that course had in it. We had some Google Docs, we had some help documents, we had some YouTube videos, some tutorials, we had a learning management system, or a content management system. There was some Skype interaction. There was a Google Drive for them to sign in. There was social media interaction. Notice that it doesn't tell you much about the content, what the student is actually learning. In a lot of ways, that's the point of instructional design, it's separate in a lot of ways from the content. It's more about the actions that the students undergo. They might do a reading, they might participate in a discussion, they might write a reflection about the content. So it underscores the notion that an instructional designer often collaborates with a subject matter expert. The instructional designer isn't necessarily the subject matter expert of the course that they are working on. Now, implementation. Here's a diagram. Here's those assessment items. Now notice that the assessment items have changed. That's probably because in the course of developing the program or the resource, some key decisions were made that some assessment items were just simply not viable. So implementation is when the course is actually being delivered. Who is the learner? Where are they located? What's their internet speed? Do they need extra support? Do they have to do all the assessments? Do they pick one? Do they need a workplace? All these questions. So there's 50 questions or more that need to be discussed, brought to the table well before the implementation occurs. That's an example, or this is an example of something that would have been already decided in the design and the development phase and is informed by the analysis phase. And every situation is different. Even though within a particular cohort of learners you might have 2,000 students that are all getting identical materials, but there might have to be some flexibility within that. So now evaluation is at the end in the ADDIE model, but I have found that evaluation is more often incorporated in an iterative way into the earlier phases, as well as at the end. If it's at the end, it's something like a survey that might go out to the students or might go out to the teachers to say, well, how was this course? What did the students think? They're critiquing it and giving that feedback, returning that feedback so it might inform future course development. Typically, evaluation is embedded into, say, the design phase or the development phase, where you might have user testing. User testing is a really good example that's very clear to understand of an evaluation process that's embedded earlier. Obviously, you don't develop the whole course. You might develop one module, and then you might have a test audience, and then you might get feedback, and then you incorporate that into the remainder so that it's going to meet the needs of your learners. Now, I was reading this book from this web link, and I liked this quote: "Create a design document first. Don't jump into development. Any training piece can start with a design document or plan. Make sure that everyone is on the same page before spending a lot of effort developing the actual deliverable." Now, the reason I like this is because it emphasizes the need for thinking and agreement and planning before people just start rushing in to start developing courses or developing media. If it's not done, you can get a lot of development that's not useful. It doesn't match up. The specifications are different. A whole range of different things can happen. So I think this is an important principle to stick with. Here's another quote: "A game is only effective when the design matches the learning outcomes." Now, in this case, they're possibly referring to an electronic game or a game on the internet or some sort of activity that is being used in learning and teaching or training. The reason I like it is because it emphasizes learning outcomes. Because games are great and they are very entertaining and enjoyable, but when they're used for training, you really do need to consider what are the learning outcomes. What's the purpose of the interaction with the game? Why is the learner or the student using that game? What are they getting from it in terms of their learning? Now, unpacking training packages. Again, if you're a vet person, you would instantly recognize performance criteria, training packages. It's this idea that you really do need to sit down, get the document, and start pouring through it, analysing what is actually being asked of the learner, and then how difficult or complex is that in terms of how you're going to be designing your course. Now, this is a first a draft. This is a test, if you like. I plan to do more of these, I plan to use a lot more video, but I wanted to just test the waters and get this up and running. So I do thank you for listening, and I hope you tune in for additional videos and slideshows as they become available.